Hey everybody, welcome back to Freedom Malts. I'm Germ, and you are Rye Curious? Yes, that was a play on words. So, instead of throwing a bunch of recommendations at you blindly, I figured let's break down rye whiskey. Maybe you can make an informed decision when you're standing in the liquor store looking at all the rye whiskeys, wondering which one should I try. Maybe you've tried a rye whiskey or you tried a couple rye whiskeys and you just didn't really care for it. Maybe you haven't tried any and you hear everybody talking about how great these rye whiskeys are and this one and that one and you just don't know where to go. So let's break it down. For the sake of this video, I am going to keep it American, but a quick note, there is a few American companies that bottle Canadian rye whiskey, and those most notably are going to be Whistle Pig and Lock, Stock, and Barrel. I don't want to take anything away from those two brands. They're fantastic whiskeys. They just don't fit into what I'm actually talking about today. So let's just get started with the very basics. What is rye whiskey? According to the TTB, rye whiskey is a whiskey distilled from a mash of 51% or more rye grain. It is distilled to no more than 160 proof. It is barreled at no more than 125 proof. And those barrels have to be new charred oak. Okay, a few variations off of that. You got rye malt. Same rules apply, except the 51% or more has to be malted rye. You have straight rye. Same rules apply with the addition of 2 years minimum in that oak barrel. And then also, if you want to do a blend of different rye whiskeys, if you still want to call it straight, all those whiskeys have to be made in the same state. Then you have straight rye malt. Obviously, it's a combination of rye malt and straight rye. And then, last but not least, there is whiskey distilled from a rye mash. This is the same rules as rye whiskey, except now, however, that new barrel is a used barrel. Okay, and then contrary to popular belief, the label of a rye whiskey bottle does not have to be green. Okay, so rye whiskey can give you lots of different flavors. It can range from very complex to very simple. The common flavor notes that you're going to get out of rye whiskey can range from citrus, anise, baking spices, grassy, herbal, tea. Those are just a few of them, but those are going to be probably about the most common. Okay, so moving into the different styles of rye whiskey across America. We're going to start with Pennsylvania style. Pennsylvania style, probably going to be argued that it is the first whiskey distilled in America way back when, 1700s, 1770s, 1760s, somewhere in there. Pennsylvania style rye is going to be a mash bill of very high rye content, 90 to 95%. The remainder of it is going to be malted barley. The most notable thing about a Pennsylvania style rye whiskey is there is no corn in the mash bill. Pennsylvania style rye whiskeys are going to be very herbal, grassy, anise. Because that rye content in the mash bill is so elevated, you're going to get a lot of that flavor from the rye grain coming through in the whiskey. A couple brands to note are Dad's Hat and Wiggle, probably the two most popular brands of rye, Pennsylvania style rye, and those are in Pennsylvania. But it does not have to be made in Pennsylvania to be a Pennsylvania style. Most notably is going to be the friends over at in Indiana at MGP. They are making that 95.5 rye. Fantastic whiskey, used all over the place, but that is definitely a Pennsylvania style rye. All right, so moving across the Mason-Dixon line, we are going to go into the Maryland style rye. Most notable difference here is they drop the rye percentage down a little bit into the 60 to 70 range. They add corn to the mash bill in the 20 to 30% range, and then the remainder is malted barley. What this does is the corn adds some sweetness to it to kind of balance out some of that rye spice that you're going to get. It makes a little bit more of a balanced whiskey. If the rye spice in a high rye mash bill is just a little too much for you, these will balance that out quite a bit. That corn sweetness really tampers down on the spiciness of the rye and gives it another added layer of complexity, if you will. These are closer to a bourbon recipe than the Pennsylvania style ryes, with the fact that there is corn in it. Most popular brand of Maryland style rye whiskey is going to be Sagamore Spirits. They have gained a lot of popularity over the last few years, and because they're making great whiskey, or they're producing great whiskey, or bottling great whiskey. Some of it is distilled in Indiana, but they do use a different recipe than the 95.5 for that. Another very popular brand of Maryland style rye whiskey is going to be the George Washington rye. This also is going to be one of the closest to early American traditional as you can get. They are producing this whiskey out of the Mount Vernon distillery, which was rebuilt in 2007. The Mount Vernon distillery was actually George Washington's distillery back in the late 1770s. They refurbished it, rebuilt it, but they kept it as traditional as possible. They're using a water-powered grist mill. They are using wooden fermentation tanks, and they are using copper pot stills that are heated by a wood fire. So, as traditional as it can get in today's age, that's going to be your one. Now, however, this does come with a pretty hefty price tag. But if you're after that kind of thing, it is worth the price. Okay, so now moving into something that's a little bit more easier to palate if you're unsure about rye whiskey, or you just didn't like the amount of spice or herbal, grassy, anise type notes that you picked up in Pennsylvania or Maryland styles. We're moving to Kentucky. Kentucky has a ton of distilleries. They all make bourbon, Kentucky bourbon, as we all know and love, right? And most of them have made some variation of rye whiskey out of their distillery. Most notable things about Kentucky style rye whiskey, or sometimes called barely legal, is it's very close to the 51% minimum. 51, 52, upwards, sometimes up to about 58% rye. Very high corn content, so in the 30s to 40s, and then a smaller portion of malted barley is going to make up the mash bill of a Kentucky style rye. These are very balanced rye whiskeys. Lots of sweetness to counteract a little bit less spiciness due to the lower content of rye. Ton of them on the shelf. I'm not going to get into naming any distilleries. However, I will name one, Maker's Mark. They do not make a rye whiskey, but most of the other ones do. Bullet, for example, though, is not a Kentucky style, even though it is out of Kentucky. It's a Pennsylvania style rye because they buy their rye whiskey from Indiana. Okay, so Kentucky rye whiskey is probably going to be the easiest one to get into if you are a bourbon lover already, or B, kind of a newcomer to whiskey in general. And C, definitely if you're a newer, you haven't tried any rye whiskeys, Kentucky style is probably going to be the easiest one to kind of get into rye whiskeys with. Personal thought here, I like to jump in the deep end, go right for that 100% rye mash bill. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, then maybe cut it back a little bit and try a little less on the rye content. But that's a personal thought. Okay, and then the fourth style that we're going to talk about is Empire style. A little bit newer onto the scene. Empire style is a New York style of rye whiskey. A little bit more reminiscent of Pennsylvania style in that it has a high rye content in the mash bill. However, the rye grain used in an Empire style whiskey 75% of that grain needs to be grown entirely in New York State. It also needs to be distilled in one distilling season, and it also needs to be 2 years old or more. Those criteria make it an Empire style rye. A couple brands to note here are going to be Kings County and Finger Lakes Distilling. Both of them make a very good Empire style rye. All right, another category to talk about, may not technically be a category, but it is definitely worth talking about: malted rye whiskey. Malted rye whiskey is fantastic. The malting process adds a whole nother level of complexity and flavors to rye whiskey, and it also softens it up a little bit, makes it a little bit friendlier to drink, especially if you're into malt whiskeys. This does have some very reminiscent mouthfeel and textures and flavors as malt whiskey does, with the added flavors of rye grain. Malted rye is probably the way that it was early in America in rye whiskey, because they were already used to malting barley, so they started malting rye. It is a little bit more difficult to work with rye grain in general, and when you add the malting process, it actually adds another level of difficulty. That being said, some of these malted ryes are going to be a little bit more elevated in price than their non-malted counterparts. Old Potrero out of California, probably the most notable brand here. They've been doing this for a long time. Their first whiskey went into the barrel in 1994. So they have, so to speak, perfected the art of malting rye grain to make whiskey. They do a fantastic job. It's a beautiful rye whiskey. It has wonderful malted notes. It has a wonderful mouthfeel, and it has great rye spice and barrel notes in it. To tie this in with American single malt, my little tie-in here is going to be Old Potrero aside. The onset of American single malt has kind of, in my opinion, made other distilleries think about malting other grains other than just barley. We've seen malted wheat. We've seen quite a bit more malted rye come onto the scene. And we've also seen a malted corn. So, very cool. I think that American single malt has something to do with that. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. It's a personal thought. But New Riff, Cedar Ridge, Frey Ranch, there's many other ones. Those are the three most notable ones that I can come up with that are doing a malted rye whiskey. They may or may not state it on the label that it's malted. Then on to my favorite style of rye whiskey, which is technically not a style at all, and it can fit into any one of the other styles that I mentioned, but craft rye. Craft rye has this tendency to be quite a bit more artistic, for a lack of a better term. The distillers and the people working at these smaller distilleries, they have the ability to change mash bills, change grains, change yeast strains, change fermentation methods on a dime, because they don't have to worry about putting out a product at the level that these larger distilleries do. So they can change stuff up rapidly and frequently, and really can embrace the exploration of rye whiskey. So there is many different varietals of rye grain out there, and some of these craft distillers are picking some very heirloom, off-the-wall, unusual strains of rye grain to make whiskey from, and some of them are fantastic and full of flavor and full of just loveliness. Sometimes these explorations can turn out not so great and they have to scrap the whole deal, but sometimes, and probably more often than not, They are just home runs and delicious, especially if you're really into rye whiskey. They can be just outstanding examples of what rye whiskey can be. Get out to your local places, see what they're doing for rye whiskey, try them out. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't. That's okay. But in conclusion here, read the labels in the liquor store, see what you got. If you know it's a distillery that makes a bourbon that you really like and you're just not sure about rye whiskey, give it a try. If their bourbon is something that you really like, they probably did a really good job making that rye as well. And again, it's going to be an easy step into the category. If you try that out and you're really liking that, then maybe step into something else. Like I said, Sagamore Spirits, fantastic Maryland style. Dad's Hat, fantastic Pennsylvania style. But there is many other brands and labels out there of all the styles than just the ones that I've mentioned. I mean, there's just too many to mention. Don't be afraid to explore it. Rye whiskey is a fantastic category, and like I said at the beginning, flavor notes can range from citrus to heavy spice and lots of places in between. Sometimes you're going to like it, sometimes you're not, and it's okay. You can't like everything out there, and everything's not for everyone. However, I do feel that if you've tried a rye whiskey and it didn't suit you, and you're turned off of the category because of that, I implore you to go out and try maybe a couple other different styles than the one that you tried that you didn't really like, and even a couple other brands in the same style, because sometimes flavors and whiskeys from one brand are going to be wildly different from another brand, even though they're relatively the same, and it can just suit you better. So if it's something, rye whiskey is something that you've tried once or twice and you didn't really like, I'm not so sure it's because you don't like rye whiskey. I think it's because you haven't found the right rye whiskey. So I hope you can take some of this information, make a little bit better of a decision, and find something that you really like. Because rye whiskey is a fantastic category, and it is just one of my favorites. All right. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching.